everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave and this is my daily ruling. Today's daily ruling is going to be a little different from usual. I'm going to be going through a real-life investigation that I did at a Grand Prix. I hope that reviewing this investigation will be interesting and informative for the judges in the audience, and I hope that the non-judges will at least enjoy to get a little bit of a sneak peek behind the curtain of what judges do at events. So first, some background. This call is from Grand Prix Cleveland in March of 2019. It was day 2 of a limited GP, so all the players had drafted their decks, and it was professional REL. Also, if you've never been to a limited GP, for the drafts they don't just open booster packs and use those. Instead, judges open all the packs ahead of time and record all the cards going into every pod to keep people from bringing outside cards into the drafts. Also, each card gets a stamp that looks like this, so the players can tell at a glance if the opponent might have done such a thing. At the time of the event, the current set was Ravnica Allegiance, and it had been out for a few weeks, so most people, at least in principle, should have a pretty solid understanding of what cards are in the limited environment. So, for the call, Amy calls for a judge and says her opening hand in Game 2 contains 2 breeding pools, although there's only one in her deck. Nick also has breeding pool in his deck and is using the same sleeves handed out at that GP, so the players agree that Amy must have somehow taken Nick's breeding pool into her deck, although the players say that neither one of them has any idea how this could have happened. I'm going to be more focused on my thought process and why I did what I did while conducting this investigation than on the correct infraction, penalty, and fix. There's 2 reasons for this. First, policy isn't written to cover freak occurrences like this, so especially when you're dealing with corner cases, it isn't always clear what the appropriate application of the philosophy should be. Second, and more importantly, I think it's much more valuable to have a broad framework that can help guide you in an investigation than it is to have one specific piece of trivia about how a specific piece of policy applies in one case. The general pattern of an investigation is to first ascertain what happened, but after that, to think about why and how it happened. For example, in this case, it seems that Amy has somehow taken Nick's breeding pool into her deck. Both players agreed on this, so the first step is pretty straightforward here. But in other cases, such as a miscommunication between players, this step may actually be the most difficult part. The next step is to determine why and how. Even if the players don't know or can't remember, we still can and should use available information to form an educated guess about these. For example, one possibility is that Amy has Nick's card in her deck because she was trying to steal it. At the time this happened, a Ravnica Alliance breeding pool could be had for about $10, which is on the order of about 10% of the prizes that these players were playing for. This, coupled with the fact that Amy called a judge on herself, pretty conclusively ruled that possibility out. Another possibility is that Amy somehow had Nick's card in her own side of the battlefield during Game 1 and took it into her deck while shuffling her permanents back in preparation for Game 2. This type of mistake is relatively common for creatures and pacifism effects, but lands are another story. There's no card in this set that can make lands change controllers, or allow players to play lands from their opponent's deck. In fact, I and the other experienced judges taking this call could produce no more satisfactory explanation for how this might have happened than the players could. This inability to produce a plausible narrative is an important trigger in your investigations process to look for more information. It's also a reason to proceed with more caution in your fix than you normally would. We asked both players to thumb through their libraries to see if any other cards were in either player's deck that shouldn't be there. While this was happening, we sent a judge to get their deck lists from the deck list team. Both of these extra steps would probably have been unnecessary if the judges and players could come up with a good mental narrative that explained why and how Amy got Nick's breeding pool into her deck. While Nick was looking through his library, he noticed something interesting. His own breeding pool. Turns out that it was in his library all along. But then, where had Amy's extra breeding pool come from? A count of Amy's library revealed that she started the game with 40 cards, so it didn't belong to a previous opponent, or at least if it did, it was taking the place of something else in her deck. About this time, the judge returned with Amy's deck list. Here we found the final piece of the puzzle. Amy had registered 40 cards, including 1 breeding pool, but just below that, in the non-basic lands section, she registered 2 Simic Guild Gates. Sure enough, Amy's deck contained 2 breeding pools and 1 Simic Guild Gate, rather than the opposite. New information in your investigation may cause you to alter your mental narrative. In this case, the old narrative of Amy somehow took Nick's breeding pool into her deck was disproved when Nick found his. The new narrative of Amy thought she had 2 Simic guild gates and 1 breeding pool, but actually had the opposite, fits the initial situation much better. It's very reasonable to think that a player could draft both of these cards and think that she had 2 of the common rather than 2 of the rare, especially if she wasn't paying super close attention. After we got both the players playing again, we found that indeed their pod did have 3 copies of breeding pool in it, so we were all satisfied that we had reached the correct conclusion. Once you've established what happened, your rules and policy knowledge take over to determine the correct infraction, penalty, and fix to assess. Investigation skills are necessary to first get to that point, though. I hope this analysis of the process we used to take this call will be helpful in your own investigations. And that's all I have for you today. Join me tomorrow when I take a look at a ruling that may seem a bit familiar. Until then, I hope you have a great rest of your day.